Okay, this is part two in our discussion of, now we begin our discussion of Genesis 1 through 11. And before I begin, I'd like to start here. And we've just talked about principles for interpretation and taking matters of authorship and audience and context seriously. So right here is an attempt of your professor to take seriously the author of the first 5 books of the Old Testament. And that's Moses. So sometime in the 15th century BC, and this would have been after the time of Abraham, 400 years, 40 years after wandering in the wilderness, just about 20 miles east of the city of Jericho, which you can just barely see in this picture over here across the Jordan River, which I think is just right along here. You've got the elevated area called the Plains of Moab, and that would be the final classroom experience for Moses in preparing Israel for the next leg of their journey. And that would be climbing down and going across to that place and fighting their first battle and taking the promised land. But what's interesting about Moses as the author, especially of the first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis, is that the history of people, places, and things, of what happens in those first 11 chapters, is not taking place in this area. It's a look back. It's not a look forward. So what we have to take, when we take Moses' authorship seriously, we have to understand that what he's doing is recounting those ancient stories, historical events, people, places, and things, and telling that story, as we've said, through the lens of historiography. He's bringing together both history and theology in the stories of the early patriarchs, beginning with Adam and Eve, all the way through to Noah, the episode at the Tower of Babel. So those first 11 chapters are screaming theology, and the theology that Moses has as high points are coming off the pages of those chapters. Every theological high point is going to speak to this audience who's preparing to enter this place right here. So that's kind of a broad stroke, taking seriously author, audience, and historical context seriously. So here it is. We've got, let me see if I can use my pen here, Mesopotamia, this area here, Tigris-Euphrates River Valley, and this is going to be the location of the events that take place in the first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis. Noah's Ark building, the Tower of Babel, perhaps the probable location of the Garden of Eden. But let's talk about the kind of a broad stroke short history of Mesopotamia. So broadly speaking, this area of the world has a long history with regards to archaeology and things that are showing up in the ground. From the primitive period to the formative period, 10,000 years ago, to about 3,000 years. 10 to 3,000 BC. This would be a time that would be best described based on what we see showing up. The people who lived here were about domesticating animals, as well as harvesting plants and establishing permanent settlements for themselves. And this is what I do in terms of dating. Where would I put Adam and Eve in terms of this history? It would be right in this area here, as an expression of the image of God that God had given them, and out of obedience to the first commands of filling and multiplying, ruling and subduing, we would have basically that trajectory showing up in humanity, expressing themselves and that image of God bearing responsibility through plant domestication, animal domestication, and establishing permanent settlements and spreading out that and establishing civilization. Even more interesting is the dynastic period that's framed between 3000 and 2000 BC. Abraham's going to show up right around 2000 BC, but even before he does, we already see evidence in this area of ancient writing. And we have the cuneiform tablets from Ur, Lagash, and Kish. The ancient city of Ur, which is Abraham's hometown, which was established as a dominant city-state as early as 2700 BC, 700 years before our biblical account of Abraham begins. But right around the time of Abraham, we have a renaissance showing up in this area. Art, literature, and law, legal codes showing up. And also evidence during the same time period of highly sophisticated writing through the examples that we have in treaty documents, letters, contracts, legal documents from all the different city-states that were established in and around this area at that time. So here's another view of the plains of Moab right here, and the Jordan River. Moses has Israel on the plains of Moab as the last classroom, where I would argue that the capstone book, Deuteronomy, would have found its completion. So their direction is this direction. They're going to be crossing the Jordan, and they're going to be fighting the battle here in Jericho. But all of the first 11 chapters, though, as we're going to be which is the primary focus of our discussion today, are not taking place here. They're taking place way over here, across that area in a place called Mesopotamia. So what we have to ask ourselves is, what were those theological high points as Moses is recounting for Israel the events that took place in Genesis 1 through 11. So let's take a look at the very first one. So what would be the primary lesson, the most important lesson theologically that Moses would have instilled or wanted to have instilled in this ragtag group called Israel? Well, you read it, and it's in the very first chapter or the very first section of Genesis, chapters 1, verse 1 through chapter 2, verse 4. I'll let you read that on your own, but I will read the kind of like the high point of that verse is in chapter 2, verse 4. And you know that the original autograph that we would have had of Genesis, and for the longest time, had no chapter and verse references. So we're continuing to read from verse 31 into chapter 2, verse 1, and we get to verse 4, and it says, "This is the account of the heavens and the earth when they were created in the day that," and here we have capital L-O-R-D, that's the translation, English translation of Yahweh. Yahweh God made heaven and earth. And capital G-O-D, there you have, is the translation from the Hebrew term Elohim. Now what's so significant about that? Most people read right over that. Well, what we read is pretty significant. And some of the, I know that there's a sequential or linear organization of chapter 1 with regards to creation days 1 through 6. But another thing that scholars point out is the parallel organization or emphasis that's also there in the text. You have in chapter 1, as you know, the creation of both forms and the idea of domains. I should say the first column here represents the things that are created, and I'm sorry, I should say the location or the sphere or domain is created, and then in the second column we have the things that are created to fill those domains. You might say that space. So verses 3 through 5 talk about the creation of the lights and heavens, and then we have the firmament, which represents the sky and the seas, and then finally in the last few verses there we have the dry land, and on it the vegetation. So any ancient author in the Hebrew Bible, any of our authors, would use parallelism to create emphasis. So then parallel to this we have verses 14 through 19, the creation of those things, that is the sun and moon, which would fill this domain, namely the light and the heavens. These sun and the moon are going to have a defined function as a byproduct of filling this space and doing something. So then the firmament, sky and seas, we have the creation of those inhabitants, namely birds and fish, swimming things and flying things, that are going to fill these two domains, sky and seas, and they're going to be given a specific job description. And we have that defined, fill and multiply. And then it gets even more interesting. The dry land and vegetation, that domain will be filled with fully formed, fully created living things, namely land animals, verses 24 through 26. And then the pinnacle of creation, the image of God bearers, namely humanity, verses 27 through 31. Again, these created things will be given job description to fill, multiply, and even more specifically for humanity, rule and subdue. And those are pre-fall commands that are all together an expression of the image of God bearing responsibility. We have the capstone of that theologically expressed in verses 20 in Genesis 1, 26 and 27. God made the beasts of the earth after their kind, after everything he saw. Oh, that's verse 25. God said, "Let us make man in our image according to our likeness, and let them rule over the birds of the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, over the cattle, and over all the earth." So God created man in his image. In the image of God he created him, male and female, and he blessed them. And then he commanded them in verse 28, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, and rule over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the sky, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." And then we have one more creation day given to us in chapter 2, and that's creation day 7. And what happens on that creation day 7? Well, verses 1 through 31 we have something pretty significant. In verses 1 through 31, after all of that description, we have something significant happen in chapter 2, verses 1 through 4. And I think it's pretty clear that Moses' audience would have clearly understood that on chapter 2, and on the 7th day, God completed his work which he had done, and he rested on the 7th day from all his work which he had done. Although it's not there explicitly in the text, what we have here is the picture of a king sitting on his throne. It's something that a king does. After he works, he sits and he rests. And then he commands that same activity from all that he's created. That's king language right there. Now, what the point is, the capstone point that Moses is making there, as we read verse 4, so this is the account of the heavens and the earth when they were created in the day that Yahweh God made the heaven and earth. Up until now in the text, all that we've heard from being described in all of his activity is Elohim God. That's the more generic Hebrew term for God. And for the very first time, we see Moses here bringing tremendous theological emphasis, because it's the first time that we hear the word Yahweh. And what's significant about that is that's the name that God uses at Mount Sinai to introduce himself to his people. It's his covenant name. And here Moses is making the theological point to Israel, who experienced Mount Sinai. By the time they get 40 years of the wilderness, 40 years prior, Mount Sinai, 40 years in the wilderness, and then they get to the plains of Moab, Moses is taking them back and saying, look, yes, the God who showed up in all the pomp and circumstances, the lightning fireworks display, spoke to you from the mountain and introduced himself by name. And oh, by the way, Moses says, he's the one who's also the creator of the universe. So we have the idea Yahweh is king, and I might add creator. And that's the foundational big idea that we'll follow that one through the entire Old Testament. Of course, that's going to lead us to another king down the road that we'll be introduced to. We'll just have to get there when we get there. And I've just given you a few verses here. John 1:1, Colossians 1:16, Psalm 8. All of these texts, both Old and New Testament, celebrate that idea. God, Yahweh. Yahweh is covenant giver. Yahweh is king. It's the big idea throughout the entire Old Testament as a focus of worship during Israel's faith history. Moses is going to develop this idea in Deuteronomy when he talks about the day when you need an earthly king. And we'll see that Deuteronomy 17 will teach and emphasize that any earthly king will never replace the idea of God or Yahweh as king over his people and his nation. So now we move on to our second big theological idea that comes off of the first few chapters here in Genesis, and it's basically this. Humanity, or Adam as representative, will represent Yahweh as king. So this is the king activity of extending some of his divine activity to humanity. So as an image of God bearer, according to what we read in Genesis 1:26, mankind is charged to express that image of God-bearing role through the commands to fill, multiply, and rule and subdue, and other things that come along the scene down the road. So Israel as a nation would have got that. They had their own experience at Mount Sinai. Moses came down from the mountain with 10, right, commands written on 2 tablets of stone. Adam and Eve, they were set up with basically what? Four basic commands: rule, subdue, fill, and multiply in a land. And Israel would have understood that oh, it's about obedience. Moses, you've given us our commands, our original list, and then your expanded list. Those are the things that we're supposed to do when we get to our land, our promised land. Now, what I will talk about later, but I need to introduce now, is this idea: to be obedient to the basic commands as an offshoot of the expression of the image of God-bearing responsibility. When we do that, we're bearing the name, or thus the reputation, of God Himself. So God as King, as Creator, as an extension of Himself, sets us up with the opportunity to represent Him, His name, which means reputation, wherever we go, as image of God bearers. So that's as an overflow of our obedience. That's what we do. His name is on our shirt. His name is on our flag. His name is on the outside of our door. Not our name, but His name. His name is the one that we represent. And here I've given you maybe a little homework assignment. You can look at this and think about it on your own, but it's an interesting theological thread. So whenever you see the language "come, let us" showing up in Scripture, there's always a violation or a threat to that image of God-bearing role and responsibility that humanity has in obedient response to God. Of course, we're going to eventually get to Abraham, which is the patriarch who, wrapped up in God's promise to Abraham, is the promise to make his name great. But in the process of making Abraham's name great, it's really about still that continuity with making and establishing the name of God. Abraham was going to have a nation emerge through him that, as an expression of corporate solidarity, they were to express as a nation the image of God through their obedience. The whole nation was supposed to represent God as King. So we'll get there down the road, but this is just where kind of the foundational ideas that come from Moses begin. Now, I've given you some extra things here, like these videos that you can watch on your own. There's threats all around us in our modern day, with primarily with the idea of Darwinian evolution, which really doesn't have a place for the image of God in humanity. So there has been a long history of Darwinian evolutionary thought, basically to devalue human beings, to take away the value that all human beings have stamped on them as image of God bearers. We can go back to the atrocities of World War II, for example, but basically what separates humanity from monkeys, cows, pigs, dogs is the fact that the image of God sets us apart and unique. We see that in simple things like the fact that we can think objectively, and we explore, we learn, we ask questions, we can be objective about ourselves, we have an innate desire to worship, to know our Creator, and all of these things are the result of the image of God. And we don't see, I've got a dog at home that doesn't do those things, so I'm very different than he is. Another thing that I want to point out here at the end of this first movie, you'll see that the Darwinian evolutionists have a very, very difficult, almost nearly impossible, it's impossible for them to explain the complexity of life, and for sure that the origin of life debate. And watch the end of that movie, you'll see Richard Dawkins basically admit that the intelligence necessary for the complexity of life that's currently being observed under microscope has to have come from another planet or another source, which is, yes, little green men. And in the next one, you'll see this guy's theory on cosmic origins has to do with the boundaries for cells had to have come for those first membranes basically on the backs of crystals, which is really odd and really strange. And you get into some really weird ideas, but Darwinian evolution has two primary processes. You've got chance and you've got survival of the fittest. Those are the things that drive the whole train. And those really basically say nothing about origins, how the first living cell came to be. And we really start thinking about it, what Darwin himself never had as a scientist. When he looked at the cell, all he saw was a blob. But look at this next slide. I give this statement here to you. You read that and you wake up in the morning and recognize that that's not something I worry about. But look at what's going on every second of every day. Your body is organizing on the order of 150,000 amino acids into carefully constructed chains of proteins every second, every minute of every day. So when we have verses that come along and say God, the Lord, or the Lord Jesus is a creator, author, and sustainer of life, we start to see maybe that's right, because this kind of thing is going on behind the scenes, and you're not waking up in the morning making this happen. It's just happening. And Darwinian evolution theorists have no ability to explain the level of complexity that's showing up in evidence like this. Here's another video that I'll let you watch on your own, but basically shows you pictorially, for all you visual learners, what goes on behind the scenes whenever you have a little boo-boo. So in the olden days, your grandma would put on a little Bactine and a little Band-Aid or a little Neosporin or something like that when you cut yourself. But what's going on behind the scenes is absolutely amazing with regards to what the cell is doing to fight infection and repair its own cell walls. And that's a process necessary for life. And all of those things would have had to have been going on in the first living cell in order for life to thrive and propagate, in order for chance and survival of the fittest to even have a chance to even work in the first place. So you can see the circular argument that's going on with regards to the origins of life debate. And let's just let science unravel itself and basically down the road come up with the best arguments against Darwinian evolution. I think that's the way that we should go. So I've got these military pictures here, maybe a little Antarctic picture of planting the flag. And what really would have spoken to Israel because of the what next for them, going into the Promised Land, they're planting the Lord's flag in the Promised Land. And let me just pause and read to you Leviticus 18. And, here's Moses sitting around the campfire on the plains of Moab, and they're asking him, so what's life going to be like in the land, Moses? And he says, neither shall you give any of your offspring to offer them to Molech, nor shall you profane the name of your God. I am Yahweh. Now, what's going on there? You've got down through verse 23, you shall not have intercourse with any animal to be defiled with it, nor shall any woman stand before an animal to mate with it. It is a perversion. Hello? What's going on? What's he describing there? He's warning them against paganism. Paganism that's well entrenched in the land of promise. And it's this paganism that's about cult prostitution, pagan worship, child sacrifice, and all kind of sexual perversion that's going on because of Baal, the god of fertility, little g god of fertility. And all of these activities are dehumanizing humans, human beings, that is, image of God bearers. Why would a pagan group of people want to sacrifice children through the fires of Molech as an expression of worship? It's because pagans devalue the human being, and that's the big threat. So we've got this pagan idea going on in the Promised Land. So part of the expression of Israel would have understood that their mandate is to plant the flag of Yahweh in the Promised Land, and that may involve some battles along the way. When we get to Deuteronomy, we'll talk about that. But Israel's what next? When they go into the Promised Land, it's really about creating space so that Israel could express itself as a covenant nation and as a proper extension of the image of God bearing responsibility that they've been given. I mean, we can't talk about this without getting applicational. How many times a day do you have an opportunity to plant the flag of Yahweh in your little nooks and crannies of your daily routine? You plant the flag of Yahweh through your obedience. how you treat your kids, your wife, your family, the kind of worker that you are for your boss. And that's all an expression of your image of God bearing. So you represent, right, someone else. It's like my kids when we go to the open houses, and as parents we meet the teacher, and the teacher says, "You're little James or you're little Hannah. Let me tell you about them." When you're not around, they represent graciousness, and they are hard workers, and they treat their colleagues with respect. They get their homework done on time. They're excellent students. They're respectful. And I'm just beaming at that point as a parent, because they're representing my name and my reputation. When I'm not around them and they're carrying that name and reputation called Smith, when they go to their A, B, and C, that's what I want to hear. That's the fatherly, proud moment, you might say, and I think that's the same kind of thing that's going on here. Now, this third lesson, the king extends life. This is another one of those big theological ideas that comes out of the first 11 chapters that we'll look at. And if we go to the end of Deuteronomy, we see a very climactic moment for Moses in his preaching ministry on the plains of Moab. And he says in chapter 30, verse 15, "See, I've set before you today life and prosperity," or that's good, "death and adversity," which is the Hebrew word for bad. "In that today I command you to love Yahweh your God, to walk in his ways, to keep his commandments and his statutes and his judgments, so that you may," here's the word, "live and multiply, so that Yahweh your God may bless you in the land where you are entering to possess it." So you can see here this idea of life. Life is not just about eternal life. Life here means more than that. It's a quality of life. It's the kind of life that extends from the blessings of covenant relationship. Israel was never expected to be sinlessly perfect, but they were expected to be obedient, and as part of the offshoot of that, God would respond to their obedience with regards to blessing. Blessing involves bumper crops of produce, lots of little baby goats, healthfully born children, relative protection from enemies. This is the quality of life in every nook and cranny of what it meant to be under covenant relationship. So we have to ask ourselves where this idea shows up in the earlier chapters of the book of Genesis, and it does. And I think you know where to go. Now, for homework, I'll let you just look at some of these slides. I'm having another conversation here with regards to life. Life is a huge theme that runs through the entire Old and New Testament. And you find life showing up in the prophets, in Ezekiel and Revelation 22 and Isaiah chapter 11, and some of these themes that run across the entire. So I'll let you look at that, but I want to get to this last slide. Actually, this slide, which really began the conversation. And we've got the tree of life in Genesis chapter 2, verse 8. "And Yahweh God planted a garden toward the east in Eden, and there he placed the man whom he had formed. And out of the ground Yahweh caused to grow every tree that's pleasing to the sight and good for food, the tree of life also in the midst of the garden, and also the tree of knowledge of good and evil." So just as Israel would have understood that the quality of this life, the blessings would have been all wrapped up and bounded within covenant relationship, they see the same kind of thing showing up in the context for Adam. Adam had access to this life, the blessings through this tree, but it was also in a way bounded up within a list of do's and don'ts. In Adam's list of commands, do's and don'ts, show up in verses 16 and 17 in chapter 2. Yahweh God commanded the man, saying, "From any tree of the garden you may eat freely, however, or from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat from it you shall surely die." And the idea of death here could also be the reverse of life, and that would be the removal from those blessings of covenant, of blessings of life, the quality of life, and all the things that go with it. To be taken away from that, you would receive just the opposite. So there'd be the experience of what we'll talk about later is the idea of futility and exile. So just as Adam would have understood, wrapped up in the commands to eat or not to eat, are the potential routes ahead for him down the road, the fork in the road, you might say. One path leads to life and blessing. The other path leads to death and the experience of exile or curse. When we read in Deuteronomy, which is the primary classroom experience, that would be the book of Deuteronomy, Moses is teaching and laying out for Israel the fork in the road ahead for them. And we read in Deuteronomy 28, starting in verse 58. We read in Deuteronomy 28 over in verse 63. This is the description language that would describe the being basically exiled from the promised land and what it would be like. It shall come about as the Lord delighted over you to prosper you, multiply you, so the Lord will delight over you to make you perish and destroy you, and shall be torn from the land where you are entering to possess it. Moreover, the Lord will scatter you from among the peoples, from one end of the earth to the other, and you shall serve other gods, wood, stone, which your fathers have not known. And among the nations you shall find no rest, which is the total antithesis of what we find in the garden. When God creates, He rests, and He extends that rest to His creation. Part of Israel would have experienced that kind of rest in the Promised Land as a product of a byproduct or an extension of them in their obedience. However, should they go down the path of disobedience, we've got exile, and that would be the removal from the blessings of covenant life and vitality and all of the bumper crops of food, and crops will be replaced with plagues and failed crop seasons and sometimes unhealthily born children, and some of these things will enter in place of. So now we move to another lesson, theological high point that Moses would have unpacked for Israel. And in the account of Adam and Eve, they were given pre-fall commands, basically, and we saw that in Genesis 1. Multiply, fill, rule, subdue, eat, and don't eat. That we just saw here with regards to the tree of life. Eat, but don't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And in this short list of commands, I think I've said it before, but I'll just repeat it. Israel would have understood, oh, yeah, Moses, we get it. Here's a list of commands, and we're to express obedience to these commands. As an expression of our obedience, God will bless us with this quality of life idea. So just as remaining in the garden would have been Adam and Eve's, would have been allowed as a response to Adam and Eve remaining faithfully obedient to these commands, remaining in the land or the promised land for Israel was wound up in the idea of obedience to the commands that had been given to Moses from the Lord. And what's interesting about reading Genesis 2 and then into chapter 3, very first verse in chapter 3, with no previous announcement, we have the opposing agenda show up in the garden. And right away, from the beginning, we see that this snake, which would be the embodiment of the devil himself, showing up in the garden with an opposing agenda to all that God had just laid out for Adam and Eve. And you've got the basic result, and I'll let you read this a little bit on your own, but the opposing agenda for the snake, or for the devil here, invites Adam and Eve to basically follow down the same path that led to his exile. I think he had a fall before the fall, and we have some hints about that in other places in Scripture, but it talks about the fall of the devil. He was exiled from the presence of God. So it's that same agenda that shows up in the garden. And part of their rebellion can be wrapped up in this idea of basically disrepudiating or rebelling against the image of God bearing responsibility. So at base level, to establish for themselves a name and a reputation as opposed to bearing and establishing the name of God, Adam and Eve now are dead set to establish for themselves their own name and their own reputation. And that's at the heart of the rebellion here in the garden that we see. So we see here in chapter 3 in Genesis a very foundational chapter in how God responds to this kind of rebellion. And we have three guilty parties, so we're going to have three different portions of text that describe the divine response against. First, the snake. And in verses 14 and verses 15, we have the divine response against the snake. We have the idea in verse 14a of being cursed. Verse 14b, the experience of futility, conflict with humanity in verse 15. And then, verse 15b, I'll go ahead and read it. We have, he shall bruise you on the head, and you shall bruise him on the heel. Just somewhat unannounced, we have this third masculine singular pronoun, he, showing up, describing someone somewhere down the road who's going to come on the scene, and in the process of bruising the heel of the serpent, he himself will be bruised. So you all know that's the proto-evangelism text that points way down the road and forward-looking to the role of the Messiah who will come on the scene and fulfill that role. Then in verse 16 we have the divine response against Eve. For her it's going to be pain in childbirth, which is just one example of the expression of futility, as well as in the second part of verse 16, desiring or having a desire for her husband, but he shall rule over you. And that's somewhat to describe the breakdown in terms of the normal ordering of the authority between the male and female. So there's going to be futility experienced there as well. Now, talk to any married couple, they're going to tell you, yes, we have conflict all the time, but it's about working through the conflict and kind of overcoming that ongoing futility. There's going to be, kind of a mutual submission idea that comes in to somewhat combat that. And two Christians, and based on the foundation of love, you can do that as a married couple. That's just a little side lesson there. But what's interesting about, as we look at Adam's list, in terms of the divine response against Adam, cursed is the ground because of you. So as a result, in toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life. And there's going to be thorns and thistles growing up against the process of growing and cultivating plants. And then you're going to sweat, and you're going to sweat when you make your own bread and when you till the ground. And there's this short list, but pointing us to this idea of imposed futility. So all the commands, multiply, fill, rule, and subdue, as an expression of image of God-bearing, are going to be met with a kind of a pushback, kind of a low-grade pushback. And this is this idea of futility. Let us turn to Romans chapter 8, verse 20, and see it described in a different context. So for here, Paul is writing in Romans chapter 8, he's talking about some of the privileges of being in Christ. In verse 14, all who are led by the Spirit of God, these are sons of God. He's talking about the family here. So, family of believers. You haven't received a spirit of slavery leading to fear, but you've received the spirit of adoption. And this is the Abba Father that we cry out, and to reflect the intimacy that we have. The Spirit of Himself bears witness with our spirit that we are children of God. So guess what? Verse 17, if you're children, you're heirs also, heirs of God, and fellow heirs with Christ, if indeed we suffer with Him, in order that we may be glorified with Him. Now the idea that Paul introduces here is he's responding to the idea and answering and addressing this situation that Christians of pretty much any time in history have experienced persecution and suffering and pain, and basically the overflow of living in a fallen world and all of these things. And Paul says in verse 18, well, he just said that the idea, part of it, is that we have this glorious future ahead waiting for us as the divine response to all of this pain and suffering that we experience. And then he says, and oh, by the way, verse 18, I consider the present sufferings of this present time not even worthy to be compared to the glory that will be revealed to us. So that's future, and that's down the road, and there's something about experiencing the suffering and the pain and maintaining our position of faith as being part of the family of God through it that amplifies the glory that's going to be expressed down the road in our future glorification. Paul says in verse 19, for for the anxious longing, the creation is waiting itself eagerly for the revealing of the sons of God. So that glory that will be revealed down the road, even all of creation is anxiously awaiting for that to take place. And here's the kicker, verse 20. For the creation was subjected to futility, not of its own will, but because of him who subjected it, in hope that creation itself will also be set free from its slavery to corruption into the freedom of the glory of the children of God. So this futility idea seems to be linked to how God has responded, his divine response to the overall fallenness of humanity. It's kind of like he's introduced this futility, and we see it here specced out for us in Genesis 3 that we just read. You know, C.S. Lewis in his book Problem of Pain talks about pain and suffering is as God's instrument or his megaphone, either driving us to dependence upon God or sometimes, in some cases, driving us away from God. But it's that idea. We're going to see this as the lesson of the wilderness that we'll see in like Deuteronomy chapter 8. And as Israel's on the plains of Moab, having come through 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, Moses sets them down and says, you shall, when they ask the question, so what do we do this last 40 years, Moses? He says, you shall remember all the way which Yahweh your God has led you in the wilderness these 40 years. Notice this, that he might humble you, testing you to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commands or not. God humbled you and let you be hungry, and he fed you with manna which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, that he might make you understand, here's the lesson of the wilderness, that man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of Yahweh. So Israel's going to get this lesson. They're going to understand that they live in a world that's fallen, and it's going to have pushback. But they are to maintain their posture of faith throughout the entire experience of this futility. They've gone through the wilderness. They've come out of the 40 years. Now they're poised on the plains of Moab, preparing to yet again encounter conflict and pushback, but on that firmer terra firma, that is the foundation of faith. That's the posture of which they're going to encounter all of the opposition that they're going to face in the Promised Land. So I've just recognized I'm going to have to move a little faster here. I've gone a little bit long-winded, and I apologize for that. All of the events that take place after the fall in Genesis 3, there's going to be, after some genealogies, we're going to see, from the very beginning, we're going to see the first murder, the conflict between Cain and Abel. But we're eventually going to get to Genesis 6. All the events are going to take place in the Mesopotamian valley area here. The first event, we look in Genesis chapter 6. And then eventually we're going to get to a place called Nippur, which is the location of the Tower of Babel event in Genesis chapter 11. But somewhere in here we're going to have the events that take place in Genesis 6, and both of those events represent basically examples of the rebellion that's seemingly concentrated in some locations with regards to humanity and what's going on as a result of the fall. So let's see what we can find. The first is in Genesis 6, and it's the question that we oftentimes get faced with if we're teaching Sunday school or a youth group, is the question of who are the Nephilim? Who are the Nephilim? And my contention is that that question is answered for us by Moses. And I'll let you look at this on your own. You can look up these verses, but there's a series of clues. There's a smoking gun that emerges with regards to the Nephilim. First of all, the word Nephilim comes from the Hebrew word naphal, which means to fall, or you might say fall. It's in the plural, so it's the fallen ones. We've got the Anakim showing up in Deuteronomy 2, which refers to the Imim, the Raphaim, the Anakim. Then we go to Numbers chapter 13, the spy report that comes back and mentions both Nephilim, and oh, by the way, they're also the Anakim. And in both situations, we've got tall, mean, and intimidating individuals showing up. always in situations that are opposing God's agenda. And then if you do the homework, you can see in Joshua 11:22 where Joshua is fighting against the Anakim, and they're pushed out of the promised land, but not quite. And there's some Mediterranean cities like Gath and some of the Philistine cities that are mentioned. And guess what shows up again in 1 Samuel 17:4? Goliath. And in a very significant event, again a turning point where God's agenda is being authenticated, that is the true king in Israel, that is David. One of these Nephilim show up, because now we can trace to Goliath all the way back to the Nephilim mentioned in Genesis chapter 6. So Genesis chapter 6 is more than just about the Nephilim. The first thing that we want to show, and in verses 1 and then verse 7, I want you to see what's called the inclusio. Both of those verses talk about the multiplication. Well, verse 6, the idea of men multiplying on the face of the land. And in verse 7, we have the divine response linked to that same phrase. I will blot out man, whom I have created from the face of the land. So really what we have here is a specific location identified with regards to kind of like what God is doing, his divine agenda, in response to this rebellion that's going to be described in these 7 verses. The first aspect of rebellion happens in verse 2, and we have the sons of God taking from the daughters of men beautiful women from whomever they choose in verse 2. Now the idea behind sons of God, I would argue, is not the idea of fallen angels. I mean, scholars go different directions with this. I think what we've got going on there is a kind of a representation, a reference to the godly line. We see the godly line being kept track of throughout the first 11 chapters of Genesis, and all the genealogies from Adam to Noah and then through Seth, and this is the godly line that gets us through chapter 6 into the flood account, and from Noah we eventually get to Abraham. But this godly line is being put in jeopardy, and the idea here seems to be an idea of rebellion, taking for themselves wives in verse 2 from whomever they chose. In other words, there should have been a limit from whom the members of the godly line could have taken for wives. So this is an expression of rebellion. And the divine response in verse 3 is basically there at the end, a limiting of the number of days, or the average lifespan for humanity to be 120 years or less. And then in verse 4 we have the reference to, and I call it a circumstantial clause in Hebrew, an oh by the way clause. Moses lets us know that the Nephilim, by the way, were also around at that time in verse 4, when all this activity of the sons of God was going on between the sons of God, daughters of men. And oh, by the way, those Nephilim, those were mighty men who were of old, men of, and really the translation comes from the Hebrew word. They're not men of renown or the idea of heroes. I think it's just men of name. And the idea of name here, I think, links to that idea that I talked about earlier. One of the rebellious ideas that comes out of Genesis 3 is Adam and Eve's, the idea of establishing for themselves a name and their own reputation in response, or in disobedience, in disobedient response to the image of God bearing responsibility, which I think has to do with carrying or bearing the name of God, that is, representing him through obedience wherever one goes. But I think Moses leaves us here with the idea that all of these people, men of name, means that the whole thing is being brought together with this idea. They're all about doing their own thing, representing themselves in their own name and their own reputation. So they are men of name. Whose name are they bearing? It's not the name of Yahweh, it's their own. It's their own name. And the reason I say that here is because in just a few chapters later, in chapter 11, we read in verse 4 that there's this group of individuals who say to themselves, "Come, let us make for ourselves a name, lest we be scattered over the entire face of the land or earth." And it's the same idea. There's going to be rebellion at the Tower of Babel, just as there is here in chapter 6. So now what happens next, I have to pop a few bubbles here. It's not a cute story about, a bunch of animals on an ark per se, but it's really more about how God is going to divinely respond to this rebellion. And the story of the flood is really much more theologically about an illustrate way of showing us how God divinely responds against this kind of rebellion. Here's a slide that shows you how concerned Moses was for name bearing in the Pentateuch, and I'll just spend just a brief time here talking about this. If you turn over to Deuteronomy chapter 5, in verse 11, we see a recounting of the Ten Commandments. In verse 11, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not leave him unpunished who takes his name in vain. So, look, I know we grew up hearing that, we shouldn't take the name of God in vain, but really this idea, based on what we've been discussing, has much more to do with words. But you misrepresent God's name. You take his name in vain by misrepresenting him and his name, which means his reputation. So it really drills down into not just what you say, but in what you do, the activity that you're involved in, how you represent God, like the illustration I gave with my kids and their relationship they have with their teachers. And the report that comes back to me confirms that they're representing my name and my reputation as their father when they go into school. So that's the idea here. Now, if we turn over a few chapters to Deuteronomy chapter 12, verse 5, when Moses starts to lay out the down the road activity of establishing something else, he says, but you shall seek Yahweh at the place which Yahweh your God shall choose from all the tribes to establish his name there for his dwelling, and there you shall come. Now guess what? That's the precursor to when Israel will build a temple. Solomon's going to do that, not King David, but Solomon's going to build a temple in the place that God chooses to establish his name. So guess what? Israel's going to go there and corporately, what? Represent his name through worship when they have church in the temple, and when under the leadership of the priests they're going to celebrate him and represent him to all the nations who are watching as a corporate group when they have worship and church, and they're going to establish his name as a covenant people. And that's what's going on there. So you see this again through Deuteronomy 12:11, 21, chapter 14, verses 23 and 24, this idea of name bearing. So I think Israel's going to understand that, and they see that in the early examples of what it means not to bear the name and reputation of God, through the example of the sons of God and through the Nephilim, and eventually here through the event at the Tower of Babel. We're going to see examples of rebellion against that image of God bearing responsibility. So I think what we have going on here in Genesis chapter 6, as I showed you the inclusio of verse 1 and verse 7 on the phrase face of the land, everything in between is a description of the target. The target is necessary, and a target is always used as a means of defining the judgment, the divine judgment in this case, that is going to be coming from God against this concentrated form of rebellion. But you see the balance of grace. In verse 8 we have the but Noah found grace in the eyes of Yahweh, and God's going to always raise up and respond to the faithfulness and fidelity of the one faithful one, and always offer the extension of that grace to others through the faithfulness and fidelity of that one. That's going to be the common ground for all the patriarchs that we're going to be looking at in the future. But we have here in chapter 6, starting in verse 11 and 12, we're going to have more full descriptions of the corruption that's going on here. And beginning in verse 5, the Lord Yahweh saw the wickedness of man was great upon the, and that word that's next in the text, earth, or it could also be translated land. It's the Hebrew word eretz, which could be translated either land or earth. So there's continual wickedness as an expression of this rebelliousness. And then in chapter 6, starting in verse 11, we have more description. Now the earth, and there's that same word, land, was corrupt in the sight of God, and the earth or land was filled with violence. Verse 12, God looked on the earth or land, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way upon the earth or land. And then in verse 13, the end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth or land is filled with violence because of them. And behold, I am about to destroy them with the earth or land. In verse 17, and behold, I am bringing flood of water upon the earth or land to destroy all flesh, in which is the breath of life from under heaven, and everything that is in the earth or land shall perish. So there's the them that's referred to there. The them is referred to there in verse 13. And part of the scholarly discussion involves what to do exactly with the, you might say, the scope of the judgment here in this case. How broad is this judgment, this divine judgment that's going on? It seems that in my I want to stay close to the text, and it seems that, you know, up until this time we've seen God defining Moses defining all of the activity going on here in the Mesopotamian area. And I draw this bullseye because it represents what I think is the basically ground zero for the judgment that is about ready to happen with regards to the flood. In other words, the target is defined. Genesis 6 introduces us to the sons of God, the Nephilim, and all of this that's going on in the Mesopotamian area, and that at least is ground zero with regards to the extent of the judgment. The judgment is being focused on that area in response to the rebellion that's just been described. And one of the things that I try to emphasize in the flood account is the extent of the flood is determined by the necessary water to accomplish the judgment that was necessary, that was divinely necessary. It seems as if in Genesis 6 in verse 1 and 7 you have the clear reference there to the land and the idea of the blotting out in verse 7. I will blot out man from whom I've created from the face of the land. And then again in chapter 7 verse 4 we have the same reference to the idea of blotting out. So after sending rain for 40 days and 40 nights in verse 4, I will blot out from the face of the land everything that I've made. And that word there is the word Admah or Adam, which probably more commonly is translated land, although it could be translated earth. But I think we have an emphasis here on land. And in verse 23 in chapter 7, thus he blotted out every living thing that was upon the face of the land, from man to animals, creeping things, to birds of the sky. They were blotted out from the land. Only Noah was left together with those who were in his household. So we have a description of the judgment. The extent of the water is being described in some of these other verses. Chapter 7, verse 11 and 12. We have the water being described in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 7th month on the 17th day. Fountains of the deep burst open, floodgates of sky were opened, and the rain fell 40 days and 40 nights. And in verses 17 through 20, flood came upon the earth for 40 days, and the water increased, lifted the ark, so that rose above there's the word again, Hebrew eretz, which could be translated earth or land. And the water prevailed and increased greatly upon the earth or land, and the ark floated upon on the surface of the water, and the water prevailed more upon the earth or land, so that the high, and that word mountains could also be translated hills. It's the same word, Hebrew har, which could be translated mountain or hill, so that all the high mountains or hills everywhere under the heavens were covered. And the water prevailed 15 cubits higher, that is about 1.5 feet or 18 inches, for a total of 22.5 feet higher, and the hills or mountains were covered. So really it's an interpretive challenge here to kind of fit it all together within what I would argue for is the theological high point of this whole passage, and that focuses on really not so much animals on the ark or even Noah on the ark, but it involves judgment. That is, what is God doing in response to this rebellion? And my head is not in the sand here, and I recognize that those of you out there who are serving in the churches, this is a conversation that you go from an event that focuses on judgment and quickly go into a discussion with regards to the amount of water necessary to form the 17 plus layers of the Grand Canyon. And I know that as your professor, so I throw this slide up just to show you one quote. And what we've got over here is the layers of the Grand Canyon, and this is really a discussion outside of the biblical text. This is not even in the verses in chapter 6 through 8 in Genesis. What we're talking about are all these different layers, some sand, limestone, cobblestone, all these different, the casino layer up here. And that's what you look at. So this is the bottom of the river, the Grand Canyon. And if you're on the south rim, you're looking at all of these layers, and it adds to the beauty of the experience and all of that. But what we're talking about, part of the conversation that sometimes becomes the focus when one talks about the flood event in Genesis 6 through 8, is how all of these layers could have been formed by a single flood event. Of course, there you're talking about the idea of a global flood, okay? But you look at all these layers, and the other part of the argument, or the opposite argument, would be each one of these layers represents a water event of some kind. Any one of them could have been indicative of some kind of flood event. So that's part of the scientific discussion out there, and you get into flood geology, which is the idea of all of the layers being basically the result of a single event, and of course the discussion in just normal geology with regards to this is just these are natural events, water events over a longer period of time. This quote here kind of encapsulates some of the discussion that's out there, and this gentleman says, "I once believed and taught, like so many others, that rock layers in the Grand Canyon represented stages in evolution laid down over vast eons of time. But after leading 15 long backpack trips, university students through the canyon, studying the rock layers and fossils up close, I'm ready to stake the place out with Bible verses. What I once assumed was a record of a lot of time now looks like evidence of a lot of water instead." This quote just kind of shows and illustrates how quickly one can go from talking about observations from flood geology, and that overlaps into the whole age of Earth question. Hopefully what I'm trying to model to you is just an approach that allows you to stay close to the text. And one of the things that just screams from the pages of Genesis 6 through 8 is that it's an event of judgment. How much water did it take? How much water was necessary to carry out the judgment that's clear and directed at that bullseye? That answers the question of how much water. How much water it took is how much water it took. That's my answer. The amount of water necessary to accomplish the judgment that was divinely mandated in response to the rebellion that is being discussed in that text. So we have to stay close to that at the end of the day, and both sides of the discussion, you might say, at the end of the day come out at the same conclusion, hopefully, that both will acknowledge that it's an event of judgment. Now I think we have to be careful and work really, really hard to bracket out the conversation that has to do with age. And the age of the earth is really a separate conversation. I recognize that sometimes it's all lumped together, but it really needs to be brought out in its own, because again, on that issue, as you know, there's positions on both sides, and even within our own church, there's going to be people that hold to an old or a young earth position. One of the things that I emphasize in my class is that, look, that's not an issue to break up a church over, nor is it an issue to break fellowship over. For example, professors that come to Southwestern sign the Chicago Statement on Biblical Inerrancy. And in a corollary statement within that document, which speaks and holds us all to hold to the idea of biblical inerrancy, which we all do, the authority of Scripture and all of that. That document also allows for an ongoing conversation with regards to the age question. And you heard me in the previous set of lectures that I think science is doing a pretty good job right now of diffusing Darwinian evolution, or at least limiting it to explain only the evidence that we see, and its inability to explain all of the evidence leaves it as a theory at best. So I disagree with this statement on your screen that says, if you look at all of these layers as evidence of individual and separate water events, that does not mean to say that in the same breath you have to adopt and embrace Darwinian evolution. The evidence isn't even in the rocks. It's not in the fossil record. We're not seeing evidence of speciation, even in the layers that are showing up in the Grand Canyon. You're not obligated to fully embrace Darwinian evolution if you think that maybe there's multiple events going on within those layers. Now, one of those layers might very well indeed be a global flood event or a very broad event, but it's a separate conversation when you get into discussions of flood geology. So probably said more than I need to there. We'll move on to the last episode in Genesis 1 through 11 that focuses on us one more example of rebellion and how God responds to that rebellion. So for the last event in chapter 11, we have the episode of the Tower of Babel. And some kind of tower like pictured here, or in an archaeological ziggurat which still exists today near Abraham's hometown. We can go over there and see that. We are talking about the location of modern day Nippur. Somewhere in this area here is the location of where the Tower of Babel event is taking place. Not too far from Ur, which is right here, Abraham's hometown, and eventually they traveled to Haran up here, and then they went around to here and ended up in the Promised Land. And what we have going on here is yet another example in chapter 11 of rebellion, concentrated rebellion. And we see in chapter 11 this group of people journeyed to Shinar and settle there, and they make bricks, and they're building a city in verse 3 and verse 4, and then the tower there in verse 4 that they intend will reach into heaven. And then we have the phrase, "Come, let us make for ourselves a name, lest we be scattered over the whole face of the earth or land." And what's interesting about this, the city, the tower, and then they establish for themselves a name. Based on what we've seen or talked about or discussed, there's continuity with Genesis chapter 3 and even Genesis chapter 1. The whole point of bearing the name and reputation of God is part of that image of God bearing responsibility. To rebel against that, we've seen, is for one to establish their own name and their own reputation and not bear the name of Yahweh in what they do, on their shirt and the hat that they wear on the outside of their door, planting the flag of Yahweh so that all can see. It's a disrepudiation of the name, of name-bearing responsibility is what we have. So what's going on here is a concentrated expression of this rebellion. And then the idea of being scattered, even there is a clue that gives us to the idea this is a group of people dead set against fulfilling the pre-fall mandate to fill and multiply. They're going to be dead set on staying put and not going anywhere. And that's another clue that I think we have in this text, that there's rebellion going on here. So the divine response, and here we have on the foundation of grace, the divine response is just an increase of futility. God turns up the futility knob against this group. He frustrates them in their ability to cooperate through confusion of language, and then an increase in futility with regards to proximity or being in the same location. So he's going to scatter them. And that's a gracious judgment against this group of people who are dead set on rebelling against God. So how is this ultimately going to be solved? This whole thing that we've seen from Genesis 1 to 3 to chapter 6 to verse 11, we see a cycle of sin. And, Moses doesn't leave us without clues as to how God will ultimately deal with this problem. And in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, if we remember, as part of the futility against the serpent, we have the reference to the he. That is one who would come on the scene. In the process of bruising the serpent, will he himself be bruised. And then we have a reference in Genesis 49. And in the blessing that Jacob leaves with each of his sons, in verse 10, the scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet. There's a reference to the scepter shall not depart from Judah. And down the road, Judah is significant because that's the tribe of which the Messiah will come. Hint, 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 right? And in Numbers 24, verse 17 down through 19, we have another reference to, I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come forth from Jacob, and a scepter shall arise from Israel. It's an interesting combination there of the star and the scepter again, that idea of something that the king will hold, or a Messiah. And this reference to the star may be a link to Matthew 2, chapter 2, verse 2, and the star of Bethlehem. And then one more verse in chapter in Deuteronomy 32. And here in chapter 32, verse 43 in Deuteronomy, we have, rejoice, O nations, with his people, for he, and this is a link to the he that was first introduced to us in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. What will this he person do? Unidentified. What will he do when he comes on the scene? He will avenge the blood of his servants. He will render vengeance on his adversaries, and he will atone for his land and his people. It sounds like Messiah activity to me, and of course Paul will pick up on that activity in Romans chapter 15, verses 10 through 12. But the question that we have to ask ourselves with clues like this, we have the full picture of all that God is going to do. He has established for himself his kingship or rulership over all that he's created. He has mandated human beings with the image of God bearing responsibility with some simple commands. We have illustrated for us in the failure of Adam and Eve what God does in response to failure or the fall. He introduces futility in response to that general rebelliousness across humanity, and it's the common experience of all to experience futility. But then ultimately we're not left in the dark, even though we have cycles of sin and we have examples that Moses gives us of pockets of rebellion and how God responds with a flood event, which is a flood of judgment, and then with the confusion of language and the scattering in the Tower of Babel episode. But ultimately we have the full picture. God is going to raise up a he, someone who's going to come along, take care of the Satan's agenda, as well as bringing atonement for the land and for the people of God. So we know all of that from the first 11 chapters of Genesis, and that's good news. So we're going to build on a lot of these themes. I know we've taken a long time talking about it, and I apologize for the length of this particular video, but this is so foundational for everything that's going to come. The unpacking of salvation history basically builds on these big lessons 1 through 5 that we've introduced, and they're going to be tracking throughout the rest of all of the biblical authors from Moses to the rest will build on these themes. So that's why it's so important to develop now. And herein lies the end of this lecture. I hope your bowl of popcorn still has a few kernels in the bottom of it. Go pet the dog, pet the cat, or kiss your wife, and go to bed. Thanks.